Hello, and welcome to part 2 of the Information Apocalypse, the Pat Roof lecture. All right, here we're going to start what to do about it. Judith Butler has a groundbreaking work, Bodies That Matter, and I think in terms of, as I mentioned, we got to have some theory to undergird this. Not that we're focusing on theory all the time. There is a disjunction between a materiality which is feminine and formless, and hence without a body, and bodies which are formed through but not of that feminine materiality. And I quote that in Women's Bodies as Battlefields. Now, I blame Plato's metaphysics for a lot of this. It sets up Western culture as the absolute negation of the female as a subject or agent. She has no agency, no power, no selfhood, mere materiality. So one of the things we do to fight back is we gain agency by performing the self. Now, I've been to more marches since this presidency began than I have since Vietnam. And you'll see here both the Women's March in Washington and me and my daughter-in-law and my granddaughter getting ready to go to the march. And I've been to a ton of marches since then because this is a way to perform the self. You get your body out there and you move in the direction you want to move, despite those who are trying to impede you or lie about you. Demonstrations and marches assert the self as an actor in community, not the solitary self. And you know, solitude has been bad for us in this COVID epidemic. Necessary social isolation, but it's isolating. You see, you are being seen. You exist. You exist in history as an agent. You are acting. You're not acted upon. You create a physical presence in the face of the threats to physical existence, both physical violence and systemic violence. I cannot stress this enough. You got to try as much as you can safely to be an agent in history, because this is a time that is trying to render many of us invisible. Why Black Lives Matter? Now, it's important not to conflate struggles and say that the struggle against misogyny is the same as the struggle with racism, the same struggle against homophobia, and so forth. Black Lives Matter needs to be focused on specifically and on its own ground, as do other struggles. Black Lives Matter because black persons in slavery were a fraction of selfhood, and that has been continuously maintained through force and the threat of force. Now, this is Judith Butler again in a Why Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter pardon me, links the history of slavery, of debt peonage, segregation, and a prison system geared toward the containment, neutralization, degradation of black lives, but also a police system that more and more easily and often can take away a black life in a flash because some officer perceives a threat. As said in so much testimony when Mike Brown, he looked like a demon. No, it's a person. The person. It's a person. This is a striking statistic from the New York Times. 15 to 25 million people have participated in a Black Lives Matter demonstration this year, 2020. Now, you figure 200 million Americans were adults. That's 8%. Now, look, this is still no proof against reframing. The protests then are taken up in the fake news cycle, and they become civil unrest. And now, thugs. They're resisting law and order. Law and order. When law is unjust, resistance is the true patriotism. But some spin it the other way. Now, if you're going to perform yourself, you still need a narrative. And this is the role of the arts, in my view. Now, speaking for myself, I have felt that I never knew slavery until I read Toni Morrison's book, Beloved. Morrison, it's a work of true genius, writes about the formation of the white self over against the enslaved self. This is a direct quote from the book. White people believed that whatever the manners, under every dark skin was a jungle, screaming baboons, sleeping snakes, red gums ready for their sweet right blood. But it wasn't the jungle black brought with them to this place. It was the jungle the white folks planted in them. And it grew and it spread until it invaded the whites who had made it. It made them bloody, silly, worse than even they wanted to be. So scared were they of the jungle they had made. The screaming baboon lived under their own white skin. The red gums were their own. This is how art, literature, fiction help us see why these fake narratives about race are fake. When you get down to it, Miss Angela Davis from this September's issue of Vanity Fair, in my mind, it's art that can begin to make us feel what we don't necessarily yet understand. Art has that capacity. And remember, this information apocalypse is trying to mess with what we understand. Black Lives Matter becomes art. These are the Black Lives Matter drawings that on the streets, like the White House is now at 1400 Black Lives Matter Plaza, but people have begun to make art within the spaces created by the letters. Becomes art. Lots and lots of art. Now, I want to talk about queering. Queering is another good way to think about how you step outside. The effort to frame you, to frame the moment in these falsifying ways. In this book, Queering Religion, Religious Queers, wonderful, multi-religious, multi-authored, starts with pride marches. Again, I am physically in this space, being an actor, as a queer person, not someone who is acted upon. Queering is turning heteronormativity on its head, right? That's to queer something, is to reverse it, turn it upside down, to get outside the normative structures that structure police gender and sexual practices. Somebody has to create the boundaries, right? This is you can be this, but you can't be that. And when you march, when you realize yourself, you say, the heck you say. Now to me, and I have been gifted to work Chicago Theological Seminary for decades and learn from my LGBTQI colleagues what it means to queer. And to me, queering is a work of the imagination. You have to imagine there is a world outside of that normative structure that is being policed, and you indwell it. Now, narrative has basically been crushed in the age of social media, right? How many words make up a tweet? It's impoverished. Fiction writing and reading, I think, is a cultivation of empathetic imagination. Now, I didn't start out my retirement to become a fiction writer, but I'd always wanted to write fiction. And you get to a certain age and you say to yourself, if not now, when? So I started writing fiction, and it was awful. It was just awful. Because everyone was me, and everyone was lecturing everyone else. This is not good for fiction. So I went to the Iowa Writers Workshop several times, as a matter of fact, because it's a different genre. You got to learn to write this way. And so I published 3 fiction works. I have a 4th one completed. And in the most recent published one, When Demons Float, it's about white supremacists invading a college campus. And my main protagonist is a young woman who is white, who is a former Chicago cop, but has decided, after her husband is murdered, to become a religion professor because she thinks it will be far easier. and of course she finds out that is simply not true. And her best friend is a campus policewoman who's African American. So there's a noose hung on the campus. And my main character, Kristen Janelli, gets mad. And she stands in the middle of the campus and threatens the invisible, but she is sure, spying eyes that are videotaping the discovery of the noose. And then the next day, Alice Matthews says to her, "You know that stunt you pulled yesterday?" Kristen just nods. "Me? If I'd done it, I'd be dead today." She put her hands on the table surface and leaned over so our faces were closer. I could smell the cigarette smoke on her breath. "You want to be brave, and hell, you throw yourself at stuff that scares the shit out of me. But you brave enough to walk around in a black woman's skin? You brave enough for that? They want us purely dead, Kristen. Every damn day." I took a breath. Now, I worked on that scene for months because to exercise the empathetic imagination on issues like this is not easy. It's not easy at all. And Kristen doesn't solve the mystery of who's doing these white supremacist, increasingly dangerous acts on campus by going, oh, these white supremacists are terrible. Oh my God, there's so. She has to identify with them and their whiteness. She's looking at the internet websites that they use. They make up fake names to communicate. What is it about whiteness in these guys and I had in common? Crap, I didn't want to go there, but I wrote down the question and I thought about it. Basically, being white always meant I assumed I was in charge. That's one for sure. Yeah, like telling Gilles, an African graduate student, what he needed to do instead of letting him decide. And worse, my late night conscience asked, would you really be willing to walk around in Alice's brown skin? Or is that just your default bravado? Probably the latter, I acknowledged. I bent back over my pad, making notes, looking down at the names I'd written, trying to see through them to the people who had chosen the names. So you don't understand whiteness, to me, as a white person, by, say, ain't it awful? You have to have enough empathetic imagination to get inside. What is it about whiteness that makes it so stinking lethal? To Kill a Mockingbird is often held up as a great classic of racial justice. But this is the fiction of the good white person. The Washington Post, but the anniversary of the publication To Kill a Mockingbird, Atticus was an unwilling participant in the racial fight. He wasn't up for this. He accepted the assignment not only to attempt to prevent a miscarriage of justice, to maintain the racial order in Macomb. He was not a civil rights crusader. He attempted to save the life of one black person because he understood the implications for his town if he did not. And when he lost, Macomb's racial order was eventually restored. Racial order in this country, like the structures of misogyny that I've just been talking about, are so deeply entrenched, you don't get rid of them unless you act a different selfhood in community. You know, there's so much powerlessness going around. The context we are in right now is one of alienation and estrangement. Internet, in any case, helps facilitate alienation and estrangement. People are more connected than ever. And what do they report? The highest levels of loneliness. They feel an enforced passivity, and that becomes aggression. When you try to offer a different worldview, I write for the public, and I want to tell you the amount of attacks that I have been subject to have risen exponentially in this time. It's actually speeding up this summer, and it's speeded up from the beginning of the shutdown for COVID. People had too much time to spend on the internet. But you've got open carry in classrooms. I know feminist teachers who have had people carrying guns sit in the front row to intimidate them in states that permit that. Streets, public meetings, online aggression. I advocate so much for what Paulo Freire called conscientization, right? Critical consciousness. You don't know Freire's work, right? He's an educator in Latin America, and he was teaching literacy. And so Freire would go into a town, and he felt people learned to read better if they could actually see their environment. So Freire would have a white flip chart, and he'd say, what's that over there? And people say, well, that's the storehouse. And they'd go inside, and he'd say, well, what's that over there? Small bags, a pile of grain. And they'd say, well, that's the bags of grain. And Freire'd ask, why is there another pile that's much bigger, also with grain? And people said, well, the small pile is what we keep, and the big pile is for the owner. And Freire, who taught them to read the word inequality. And they didn't just read, they saw their world. And of course, they threw them out of Latin America. So the process of developing a critical social reality, to see your social reality, is both through reflection and action. Whether it is making physical art, whether it is reading fiction, writing fiction, creation helps reflection. You got to put your body into it. Get out there. Method. Freire's method of teaching people to read by actually seeing their world. So few people, in my experience, actually see their world. But as we said before, seeing is not believing. When something is presented to you in video format, assume there are contradictions. Look for the contradictions. Nothing helps you learn to do that better than the really good fiction that I am. And I am not putting myself in the same category as any of these classical writers that I've mentioned. But you read fiction, you write fiction. And what I have said to every student I have taught for the last 20 years, write for your local paper. Nothing changes unless it changes in the culture of small communities. You write, and then you experience. Letters to the editor. Go ahead and do that. Believe me, this makes a difference. But you can't do it if you don't free yourself from the thrall of the suppression that the fake news of our time provides, even if it's merely that you get depressed because you've got this barrage of terrible news coming at you. You have to create space for you to be creative, in community, for there to be an us. Now, it's not truth versus falsehood. It's self-consciousness or self-deception. Don't think. And I think I have confirmation bias. I like to read the news that confirms my worldview. It's an effort for me to try to find stories about the same thing that come from a totally different perspective. But in order for you to develop self-consciousness, in order to engage in conscientization, you have to fight back against your own confirmation bias, even when you see the falsehoods in how things are framed. So, we're going to have some questions. Here's a few. You may take them or not. You're a Russian bot. Pick a recent news story you've read that, were you a Russian bot churning out polarizing news stories, you would promote to divide us. Make a headline for a fake news story you would think would divide us. What fake news story did you at first believe? The work of critical consciousness in the era of information apocalypse is enormous. But remember, the way we fight back is to know that it trades on some of the deep truths that have structured the society the way it is. It's deep homophobia, it's deep racism, it's deep sexism, it's xenophobia. So we don't just fix the fake news. We have to deal, finally, with these structures. Thank you so much for listening.